On this episode of What's Going On with Shipping, the United States has seized a 6-tanker off the coast of Venezuela. Does this make the United States the best or the worst pirate in the world? I am your host, Sal Mercogliano. Welcome to today's episode. A little quote there from the first Pirates of the Caribbean movie. It's the best of the series, in my opinion. We're going to take a look at this 6-tanker that the United States has seized. We're going to take a look at the other 5 and what is going on and what does this mean for the oil tanker industry. If you're new to the channel, hey, take a moment, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you'll be alerted about new videos as they come out. So this video is from United States Southern Command. This story from G Captain, U.S. military and Coast Guard forces carried out another pre-dawn boarding in the Caribbean, seizing the sanctioned motor tanker Veronica in the latest escalation of Washington's crackdown on vessels tied to Venezuela's illicit oil trade. Marines and sailors from the Joint Task Force Southern Spear, operating from the aircraft carrier USS Gerald R. Ford, took control of the tanker without incident. U.S. Southern Command said the operation was supported by the Navy's Amphibious Ready Group, including USS Iwo Jima, USS San Antonio, and USS Fort Lauderdale. According to Southern Command, quote, through Operation Southern Spear, the Department of War is unwavering in its mission to crush illicit activity in the Western Hemisphere. The only oil leaving Venezuela will be oil that is coordinated properly and lawfully. So U.S. really kind of drawing the line here. We are seeing some oil tankers come in and out of Venezuela, but that's through non-sanctioned oil, in particularly Chevron, which we're going to talk about here in a second. So a quick snapshot here of marine traffic showing the coast of Venezuela. Again, just to remind everybody, there are 3 main oil facilities in Venezuela out here in the east. This is the Jose Terminal, where we see a lot of tankers come out. There's a smaller facility here in the center at Puerto Cabello, and then the facility where we have a large number of tankers. And so the U.S. is monitoring. So one of the things we've seen is a reduction in the number of U.S. forces in and around Venezuela. Again, you don't need to have as large a force off the coast. I think a lot of that force was there for the takedown of Nicolas Maduro. Now the United States is just in the process of monitoring, tracking these oil tankers as they come out. So there have been 6 tankers seized by the United States. The first was the motor tanker Skipper back on 10 December. This was a Guyana flag vessel, 310,000 tons, 21 years old. The ship was carrying about 1.8 million barrels of oil. The ship was seized and has been taken and is currently anchored off the port of Houston. The second ship was the Centuries, grabbed 10 days later on 20 December. This was a Panamanian flagged supertanker, 309,000 tons, 25 years old. This time, the United States got the permission of Panama to board this vessel. Again, 1.8 million barrels of fuel on board. She is also anchored right now off the coast of Houston. Then we have the ship that captured everybody's imagination. This was the Marinara, previously the Bella 1. She was also Guyana flagged. She changed her registry over to Russian when she was pursued by the Coast Guard cutter Monroe. The ship was stopped just east of Antigua. The ship refused to stop, issued several distress signals, and then proceeded to sail northeast, heading toward the Russian Arctic ports. The United States staged some forces into northern Scotland. The Monroe proceeded to chase after the vessel. We saw small Army Little Bird helicopters, the AH-6s, flown up into Prestwick in Scotland. They then flew out and rendezvoused on board the Coast Guard cutter Monroe, the USS Paul Ignatius, which is an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, and potentially one other Arleigh Burke-class destroyer. If you watched my video on this, I got it wrong. I said that they may have used the USS Puller, which was an expeditionary support base. However, Puller has been sitting up in Croatia and was not withdrawn for this operation. So my apologies. But again, you have to make assumptions as you go along. I thought it could have been Burke-class destroyers, but the ideal platform would have been that expeditionary support base. But they were able to pull off this seizure without it. The ship is in port in Scotland for a very good reason. It's swapping out crew. I saw this ad that was posted by Clyde Marine Recruitment looking for a full crew, this is just for the master, of a VLCC, very large crude carrier, for a U.S. Gulf Coast 2 to 4 week assignment. So they're replacing the crew on board the ship with a crew that they're recruiting right now. Now, the same thing was done, I should mention, on Skippers and Centuries. U.S. crew in those cases were flown into, I believe, either Puerto Rico or the Virgin Islands brought out to the vessel so that they can crew the ship and bring them over. The crews on board, a lot of questions about the crews on board. The crews on board will be released, even though the president talked about that they're going to be prosecuted. Unless they have broken U.S. law, those crews are going to be repatriated. Now, if I can go back to Marinara for 1 second, I do need to deal with I don't know what to call it, but there are reports out there that Marinara is loaded with gold from Venezuela and drone and missile technology from Iran. And the ship was basically being used to mule these goods around. First off, how is it loaded with gold from Venezuela if it never arrived in Venezuela? You know, they're saying like 1.5 tons of gold were loaded on board. There is commercial ships going in and out of Venezuela every day. Container traffic hasn't been impacted at all. So why would they put 1.5 tons of gold on a ship that never got into Venezuela? Second, the drone technology. Again, there are commercial ships coming in and out of Venezuela. I just, again, the amount of information that comes out sometimes really kind of boggles the imagination. So the fourth vessel is the M. Sophia, another oil tanker. This is a VLCC, very large crude carrier, 320,000 tons, 22 years old. Again, Panamanian flag. Again, U.S. got permission from Panama to board this vessel, and there's an agreement between U.S. and Panama that allows the U.S. to board Panamanian vessels. We estimate about 1.8 million barrels of crude oil on board M. Sophia. We do not know her exact location. We think she is off the coast of the United States, but her AIS transponder has not been turned on. M. Sophia and Marinara were grabbed on 7 January. 2 days later, the Timor-Leste tanker Olna was grabbed. Now, this is a 115,000-ton Suezmax tanker. She's carrying about 700,000 barrels of fuel on board. She was seized by the United States, and again, do not have a current position from her. Her last reported position was back on January 14th, kind of in the anchorage off of Venezuela. Probably what's going to happen with her, and what we've seen happen with ships grabbed off the coast of Venezuela, is that they will be sailed northward toward the Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, have the crew swap out, and then sail over to Houston. And then the ship most recently grabbed, this is on 15 January, the Veronica, which has been subsequently renamed Galileo. This ship was also flying a Guyana flag, 23 years old, 115,000-ton Suezmax tanker seized by the United States. We don't know her capacity and what she has loaded on, but based on her size, she should be very similar to Olna. And if that's the case, the United States now has possession of 6 tankers with almost 7 million barrels of fuel on board. Looking at current reports, there are about 17 tankers off the coast of Venezuela. They have estimated on board about 15.5 million more barrels of oil on board. So the U.S. has not stopped in its seizures. 6 seizures starting back on 10 December, with the most recent being on 15 January. So what does this mean going forward? What are the implications of these seizures, and what impact is it having on the tanker market? Well, there are a couple of stories I want to highlight to you, showing you what is afoot right now regarding these tankers. So one, this story over at GCAP, Mike Schiller back on January 9th, the maritime unions within the United States are pushing for a U.S. flag mandate on Venezuelan oil to help rebuild the American shipping fleet. What they're calling for are, the major maritime unions are urging the Trump administration and Congress to require that any Venezuelan crude imported into the United States be carried exclusively on U.S. flagged vessels crewed by American mariners, arguing that the move would strengthen the national security while jump-starting the long-declining domestic shipping fleet. So, the U.S., and I've been talking about this quite a bit on the channel, that the U.S. is trying to rebuild the U.S. merchant marine, and one of the ways you do that is by reflagging vessels. Ironically, the ships that have been seized, once they go through the federal court process, and they will go through a federal court process, they'll go through the federal district courts. Those will handle what are basically admiralty law hearings. Those ships could be condemned, sold for auction, bought by a U.S. firm, and reflagged into the U.S. registry. And believe it or not, because they were condemned and seized by the U.S. government, they are actually eligible for exemptions under the Jones Act. Now, you don't need a Jones Act exemption to haul oil from Venezuela to the United States. States. Jones Act is just between U.S. ports. But these tankers could become U.S. flag vessels. You could put U.S. crews on them, and those 6 tankers could be involved in the transport of oil from Venezuela. You could also reflag in commercial tankers into the U.S. registry, and there are U.S. flag tankers out there on the commercial market right now that could be used. It is interesting to note, again, that this is a process whereby the U.S. could see the U.S. Merchant Marine begin its rebuilding process. Second story involves this. This is a Reuters story. China flagged supertankers that abort their Venezuela run as U.S. oil embargo tightens. 2 China flagged supertankers that were sailing to Venezuela to pick up debt-paying crude cargoes amid the U.S. oil embargo on the OPEC country have made U-turns and are now heading back to Asia. We talked about these 2 tankers previously. This is a significant element because Venezuela exports a large chunk of its oil over to China, and that oil trade right now has been severed. Now, China can make up that oil shortage by getting oil from other countries without a problem, but for Venezuela, this is a significant reduction. We got this story from January 12th, also by Reuters. Big oil companies have injected a heavy dose of realism into U.S. President Trump's plan to rapidly invest billions into Venezuela, pointing to complex security, commercial, and legal requirements to revitalize the country's crumbling oil industry. So if you haven't been following this, the oil that comes out of Venezuela is a very heavy crude type that's really well suited for use in U.S. refineries. U.S. refineries were really geared to this type of oil. However, they are getting the oil for the refineries from Canada. And Canada is a much better choice than Venezuela. Number one, that transportation system is in place to get the oil from Canada down into the U.S. refineries. Canada, obviously, much better stable country in terms of its politics than Venezuela is. Some may argue, but it's true. It is a much better stable country than this. And so the oil industries don't want to invest heavily into Venezuela because, again, they've been burned in the past by Venezuela. And to get that up and running is going to take a while. And so the oil companies, which President Trump had them come into the White House, huge event, really gave a little bit of a realism here to the issue about whether or not Venezuelan crude is going to supplant the oil coming out of Canada. It's not. It could be on top of and in addition, which I think is what you'll wind up seeing. Next, we have this, also from Bloomberg. Oil tanker rates jump as U.S. push into Venezuela shifts the flows. So the ship market is being shaken up by this Washington intervention as the prospect of more oil being exported to the U.S. boosts regional tanker rates to the highest level in almost 2 years. I will also add that the uprisings in Iran are shaking the oil market right now. That instability is causing the tanker rates to go up. And because there is a finite amount of tankers out there, again, there's only so many tankers out there, and we have not been rebuilding and investing in this fleet. The tanker fleet is getting progressively older. That's why we see so many tankers in the dark fleet, because they reach a point. Almost all 6 of those tankers I showed you are over 15 years old. So most of them are over 20 years old. They are not replacing those tankers. And then final story we have goes back to the kind of joke I had at the beginning. Is the U.S. the best or the worst pirates we've ever seen? Now, real quick here, the U.S. is not pirates. To be a pirate, you have to be lawless and stateless. You have to be not a member of a nation. By definition, nations cannot be pirates. Now, their actions could be piratical, and I do love saying the word piratical, I'm not going to lie. It's one of my favorite words to use. But the U.S. is following the rules of the law. I've done this in multiple videos, and I've talked about this. Stateless vessels under the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, which neither the U.S. nor Venezuela has ratified, I know. But under the Law of the Sea, if you are a stateless vessel, Article 110, Section D, you can be boarded by naval vessels and basically the port state control of nations, and that's what's happened. In the 6 cases I identified, those vessels were all identified as stateless. In the case of the 2 Panamanian vessels, Panama has a treaty with the United States that allows the boarding. In the case of the Guyana and Timor-Leste flags, those were seen as false flags, therefore the boarding could take place. And in the very complicated case of Bella 1 Marinara, that was a stateless vessel that re-registered to Russia mid-voyage. And under Article 92 of UNCLOS, that's really frowned upon. Now, you can re-register in the middle of a voyage, but you have to show proof of change of ownership. But the argument the U.S. is probably going to make, and I don't have it for sure, but this is the argument I believe they're going to make, is that because the ship was a stateless vessel to begin with, you can't re-register it into another country without doing the proper inspections to ensure that ship meets the requirements to be flagged. In other words, is it classified by an outside classification agency? Does it have insurance? Does it meet the requirements of the safety of life at sea and the marine pollution conventions? In fact, there is an issue. I think one of the reasons why you have not seen, for example, M. Sophia and Olna arrive off the coast of the United States is that those ships can't get into U.S. waters because they have deficiencies that have to be corrected before they can enter U.S. waters. So I think they're in the process of doing that. That's one of the reasons I don't think we've seen them show up yet. So we have this last story, which comes from Lloyd's. So this is a story by David Osler. U.S. tanker seizures rely on armed force rather than the law. Washington seeks warrants for dozen more ship arrests, and there have been. We've seen at least the redacted issues of about a dozen ship arrests that are out there. Legal basis is likely to be domestic legislation, not UNCLOS. Under UNCLOS, you can board the vessel, but it doesn't clearly state anything about seizure of the vessel. And this is, again, goes back to the issue of maritime law. Maritime law is not well written out. It's just not. The entire UN Convention of the Law of the Sea is 200 pages. The Code of Federal Regulations in the United States is 190,000 pages. Everything isn't spelled out, but what you do in that case is if you board a vessel, you find it in violation, you take it into territorial waters of a country and you adjudicate it. And that's what the U.S. has done so far with two of the tankers, the Skippers and the Centuries. In U.S. courts, they have filed warrants against these ships and have arrested them. In other words, they have put a warrant out for their arrest. Ships, like human beings, can be held liable for crimes. And when you arrest a ship, you bring it into jurisdictional waters, and then you adjudicate it. And, if the owners of the ship and owners of the cargo want to come in and defend it, they can. And in the case of Skippers and Centuries, we believe they will. And so we're waiting to see those court trials take place. They should be open, and we should be able to get some information at that point. Lloyd's is talking about is that the U.S. seems to be relying more on U.S. law than on international law. And it's hard not to make that case because the U.S. is not a signatory, it is a signatory, but it has not ratified UNCLOS, the law of the sea. I'm a firm believer the U.S. should ratify the law of the sea. I don't know why we haven't done it. I think it builds up the U.S. Argument here to do this. We hold other countries to the standard, in particularly the Chinese in the South China Sea against a country like the Philippines. The U.S. should think about ratifying UNCLOS. It takes 2/3 of the Senate, 67 senators to do it, and I just wish we would get that done because it removes an argument that I hear all the time that the U.S. is not a member of UNCLOS. The U.S. is not a pirate. It's not the best pirate or the worst pirate I've ever seen. It's not a pirate at all, because it is executing laws. Now, what this does do, and the fear we should start having here, is what are the bigger ramifications? We've just saw Germany, for example, prevent the entrance of a tanker into the Baltic through its territorial waters. There is discussion about Great Britain or maybe European nations boarding these stateless vessels and doing something similar to what the United States is doing. I have to say, I am in favor of boarding stateless vessels. Ships sailing out there without proper registry don't have insurance, don't have inspections. Having insurance is the key. Being able to have insurance up to $3.1 billion is what you need. We just saw in a UK court the master of the ship called the Salong that ran the Stena Immaculate basically caused the death of a mariner on board his own ship, nearly caused a massive tank oil spill off the coast of England. There are accidents happening. The Dolly hitting the bridge in Baltimore. If Dolly did not have insurance, that would have been on the state of Maryland to cover all of that. Ships need to have insurance, and it's not just fly-by-night insurance. It needs to have insurance in a large group so that they can pool their resources together and cover these massive claims so that if you spill 1.8 million barrels of oil, that's 75,000 gallons of fuel you have the ability to pay for the cleanup should that accident happen. And again, this is highlighting the issue that has happened with the creation of the dark fleet. Now, dark fleet is a direct creation of efforts to circumvent sanctions. It's also a result of the sanctions being imposed. You don't get a dark fleet without sanctions. You don't get, sanctions without the dark fleet. They're kind of, self-fulfilling prophecies here. And so we really need to do something in the International Maritime Organization, among the nations of the world, to really start preventing this dark fleet from becoming a permanent feature out there, because it's operating outside the bounds of the rules of law. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, hey, take a moment, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so be alerted about new videos as they come out. Leave a comment, share it across social media, and if you can, support the page. How do you do that? You hit that super thanks button down below, or head on over to Patreon and become a monthly, yearly subscriber. I'm going to go grab some rum. Been talking about a lot of pirates here, and plus I'm still a little buzzed from the last episode I did talking about the U.S. ship going through the Bab el Mandeb. Cheers.